Latimer City Expats Club is a non-profit social organisation and our speakers are volunteers. The club as such assumes no responsibility or liability for the professional reputation of or the quality of services provided by the speaker today.
No, I definitely don't. Oh, okay. So, quite something to follow. I'm an architectural engineer, and I usually am presenting in front of a smaller but more hostile audience, full of NIMBYs who don't want my project to be approved. So, following a singer is a little unusual. I really did enjoy some of your stuff. It was great. Thank you. So I'd start out by telling you that I was just trying to lighten things up here a little bit to start with. But you could go to the, I don't have this clicker. Or I could just say next slide. That would work for me because there's only a few slides. Okay. So I started out having a friend say to me, I want to find out if I can get some funding for my business, and I heard about this group that's a meeting at the college nearby, but he had a conflict, so he sent me. He said, do me a favor. I said, I don't know anything about it, Well, go there and see if it's something that's going to help me. And when I got there, they were doing a presentation. I was actually early, so I ended up seeing stuff that wasn't open to the general public as much, but I joined in and they were doing like a Shark Tank type presentation, if any of you have seen that TV show, which is pretty popular in the US and supposedly around the world. Anyway, not really a Shark Tank because there's nobody trying to be funny and there's nobody trying to be Mr. Wonderful. But on that subject, and that was sort of interesting, but then the kinds of questions and the kinds of people who were there just blew me away. I had not been in a room with that many intelligent people, and I went to a high-end engineering university. That was just, I said, boy, this is something that I'm interested in. And then they had a sign-up list to say that they were thinking of starting this angel investment group, which is a fairly new idea that was only recently allowed under regulations in New York State and stuff. So I said, I've got to be in on this. And I was one of the first 12 to sign up, which helped them get to critical mass and pursue. So they ended up forming this group with a little guidance from another slightly older group nearby, and we ended up with 43 investors. And the program was you had to put in $25,000. I think I've skipped ahead, so if you want to get next slide. So you get $25,000, you got a vote, and you could only get maximum 2 votes. No matter how much money you put in, because you could have put in more money. Nobody did, actually. I think there was somebody who invested once for themselves and once for the company, and they were limited to 1 vote. So then what we did is we started having these meetings and we started learning. Like any volunteer organization, including this one, there were 3 or 4 people who did all the work. I wasn't one of them, I'll have to confess. But you had to be an accredited investor, or you had to say you were, to sign up. And that's an American federal thing, having to do with either your income or your net worth in order to invest. And if you want to move on. So the idea of it was to try to foster development in our local area. So it was called the Hudson Valley Startup Fund. And the idea was it had to have a base or in the Hudson Valley. It didn't have to be limited to that area, but it had to have some kind of strong tie, like a resident there or a company there. And the idea was that we were trying to help them. We were not just trying to invest money. We were trying to foster these companies, and that's why they say to do well and to do good. And the good was important. As time went on, it even got a little more politically correct about ESG stuff, and we had searched pretty hard to find any female-run companies, but we did find some, and so we invested in a number of things. Go to the next slide. So these were the kind of subjects, you know, it was either pre-seed, which means really early, right after friends and family. My friend, by the way, who kind of was the reason I got there, he never did go that far because he just didn't have the energy. I mean, most of the entrepreneurs that came to us, not all of them, but most of them were fairly young. They didn't have families. They could take risks. They could work hard. They could work, 16 hours a day. And so we tried to work with them, and you see there's social equity, sustainability, local impact. In the beginning, it seemed like it was mostly local impact, and scalability is a real big thing. In other words, we don't want to invest in a restaurant. I mean, it's just never going to blow up 10 times. And you want to look for a business that could blow up at least 10 times, and because so many of them will fail. Next slide. And so these are some sort of general rules. I think we were a little more optimistic than this, but I think these are the general rules for angel investing. That 1 out of 10 is going to blow up and make a lot of money. And a large number of them will just completely crumble. I found the meetings to be just one of the more enjoyable things that we did. What we'd do is we'd have a step on to the next slide. These were the things we'd consider about what kind of problem they were solving in the market, and how big was that, whether there's a chance for getting ahead. And if you notice the capital letters down at the bottom, the team or the people was probably the most important thing we were evaluating. Did these people have the necessary skills? Did they have the skills in their profession? Did they have the skills to manage the financing? Did they have the marketing skills? Was it 2, 3, 4 people, or was it one person who was trying to do all of it? The deal terms would be, what kind of capitalization rate. In other words, what percentage were we getting for our investment? Typical investment was a convertible loan, meaning we'd lend them money. Nominally, there was an interest like 8%, which would be accrued and not paid. And then after a certain term, usually 2, 3 years, there would be a conversion or an extension. And the conversion would be converting to that stock or that percentage that was negotiated in the beginning. Next slide. The pitch presentation was something that we often had to help them with. They had a business, they had ideas, hopefully they had a business plan, but they didn't often know how to do a pitch, just like I wouldn't have known how to do a pitch. Maybe still don't. But there would be somebody from the fund who would be assigned to be like their mentor and volunteered to steer them through this whole process, which would do them good in the long run, because it wasn't just getting through us, but presenting to anybody else. I mean, the Hudson Valley in New York was centered about an hour and a half north of New York City. But, another hour further north, you had another group called the Albany area, There was also a fairly informal but rich group a little bit further south as you got closer to New York City. So somebody could, and you know, once they learned how to do the pitches and what they needed to do, they were off to a running start. So, you know, these are some of the things, like how did they present? Were they, and one of, you know, did they speak better than I'm speaking right now? Hopefully. And one of the real requirements was that the founder or a founder had to be doing the pitch. It couldn't be an actor or a paid pitch man. You know, we wanted the owners there presenting. Next slide. So this was a more detailed list of what we expected to see in the presentation. I think I don't want to try to read it all, especially since it's behind me. But I'd say there's no one secret there. I mean, you know, different people had different failings, different people had to work on various aspects. And hopefully the club can let other people have copies of that through the website or whatever. Next slide. So these are the 12 companies that we had 2 funds. So between the 2 funds, we ended up with about $2.5 million to invest. Our typical investment was about $200,000, plus or minus, and it would often be in stages. In other words, we'd give them $100,000 or $75,000, especially if they were a very early company. And then after they met certain milestones, we would give them some more money. We covered quite a range. The top 3 were all kind of high-tech. Internet. Bussy was a company that trying to create a website for or an app for companies to charter their buses. You know, you learn a lot of things in this group. Where we were, there were a few bus companies that ran, you know, scheduled buses, but it turns out that's like a minor part of their business. Their real business is chartering buses. And right, in the US, it's all done by the phone. It's all done with a salesman and a phone call. And now this company was setting up an automated app to install in various companies like Trailways and US companies like that. UAT was a high-tech clamping system to install in aircraft for wiring, and they had 2 things. They had a simple one that was synthetic. Instead of being steel, it was an organic or plastic of some kind. But they also had developed one that was the sort of real target of their business, and that came in second. And that one had some sensors in it so that they could reduce the requirements for changing the wiring in helicopters and airplanes by having more information. And there were some former military people that did that. The second row were more sort of social. Lesson B was actually was a single woman run business about sexual training in schools, and she was trying to take over being politically sensitive and culturally sensitive training to sexual stuff for elementary and high schools. I'm not sure exactly what grade. That wasn't a subject I knew much about, so I didn't pursue that one very much. The Hudson Harvest was a company that was gathering together various organic food sources and offering them as a group to restaurants and marketing. So they were trying to sort of be the food delivery company for organic small farmers. JICA Foods was a jicama-based food product company. We had 2 companies that are not on this list because they were 2 of the some that failed. They were the two that have failed in the 5 years that this has been going on. One failed because I would say he was trying to raise very clean organic shrimp indoors in the US, and he had no problem marketing his shrimp at a very high price because it was clean and you could eat it as sushi. But it was something where he was just undercapitalized. He didn't know how to manage money. About the only thing he wasn't as technical as he should have been. He ended up with some change in the water supply and killed all his inventory. And basically, if he was undercapitalized, that put him out of business. So it's a combination of things. Another one, and we learned a lot from, that was our first investment. So we knew the least, and it was the first one to fail, which showed, how important the training or the experience was on doing that. Some of the others were more technical. The website U Stadium was somebody trying to make a social network out of sports fans. They were starting with American football. They were a little undercapitalized, but very dedicated, and there were two of them, and they were willing to work and live for next to nothing, and so they're still in business, but they're not making a lot of money, that's for sure. And we had one exit, which was Simplecast, and that's the one exit so far, and that's, of course, the idea of investing is that you get an exit. Now, we only made about 2.5 times on that, but it was within about a year of our investing. It was a low-risk investment that we knew we had to rush. We had to almost skip stages to get in on that. But it was an entrepreneur who had succeeded in the past, and he was producing a podcasting platform, and he got bought out. So we invested at 2 different stages, so that's why it's a little vague as to what our exact return was. I think on our first investment we made over 3 times, and on our second investment we made about 2 times. So I think I'll end it there and ask if there's any questions, because I'm happy to answer questions.
Yeah, hello. You're obviously aware against the background against which you're pitching this, not Hudson Valley, but Silicon Valley, which has just gone down the Swanee to quote an Americanism. These are very high-risk investments, and I don't know the detail of what went wrong in America, but Biden was certainly quite scathing in his criticism of the directors. What's your attitude towards the background against which you're making this pitch to us?
Okay, well, first of all, I'm not asking anybody to invest. I don't have a fund here. I'm not selling anything, but I think it's interesting what you say about the Silicon Valley Bank. The primary problem with the Silicon Valley Bank was that they had sort of followed all the federal regulations, and that their cash, and they have to keep a certain big percentage in cash these days in order to be safe, their cash was in 10-year federal bonds. And guess what? When the interest rate goes from 0.5% to 6%, the price of the bond that you're holding goes down drastically. And so then when they announced that they had just lost $15 billion by selling some old bonds, they had lost that money. They were only capitalized at $16 billion. They only had $16 billion of equity. So they had announced in January that they lost this money. And it really had nothing to do with the fact that a lot of their people were venture funds. Now that may have made it a little bit worse because they were very sophisticated people, and as soon as they read the annual report about the loss, they said, I think I'll take my money out. Well, in order to get the money, the bank has to sell bonds, so they tried to raise some money, they tried to sell some stock, and that fell flat, and then they collapsed. So they didn't really collapse because of their technical investments. They really collapsed because the Fed's raised interest rates and the banks are required to keep a 10 or 20% at least in federal funds, and they kept like 50% of their money in federal funds. And that was a big mistake. But that really didn't have much to do with the angel investing. The angel investing was, and they were mostly later stage. I mean, I'm sure they were involved with had bank accounts that belonged to angel investors. So the ramifications in Silicon Valley, fear on Friday that come Monday they wouldn't be able to write any checks. That was the problem out there. It really didn't have anything to do with where their investments were, except that they were in federal funds. And that basically, I mean, I've read people who say that all the banks are basically bankrupt, but until you want your money out, they're okay, because on the books they all have money. Any other questions about the angel investing?
Michael, thank you so much. I thought that I have a background in business, so I thought that was really interesting. Round of applause for Michael for getting out and doing that. I want to share an experience once. I went to, it was a sort of a startup that had been around a while, and they were trying to raise investors for it. And there was this long spiel. I said, okay, in 17 words or less, tell me what the business is about, right? And then just went on a spiel for I don't know how many words. And I knew they were going to fail then, right? If you can't sum up your business in like 17 words or less, you're in trouble. That's what you said, the 15-minute rule, right?
Yeah, so our rule was that the presentation had to be total 15 minutes, and you were covering about 10 or 12 points that were on that list. And the first one was, you know, who are you, what are you doing, basically. And then we couldn't interrupt them. So, nice quiet audience like this one. But then we'd spend another 15 minutes asking questions like, I didn't understand what you said there, or could you elaborate on, you know, what you're going to do with these funds? Are they going to be used to pay some new people, or are they going to be used for inventory, or, you know, those kinds of questions. And then we'd make them leave the room, and then we could talk about them behind their backs and discuss whether we thought this was something to pursue. We wouldn't be investing at that stage. We'd be doing more due diligence at that stage if we decided to go ahead, or if we decided to. No, these guys aren't ready.
Thank you. I really actually appreciated your talk. It made me think about just general life projects and how you have to really, if you've got a major project you're starting out, you want to get really clear in your head what you're doing and why you're doing it and how you're doing it. So thank you so much, Michael, and I look forward to getting you back after you sojourn in America.